Hello everyone, welcome to yours and my favorite part of the week. That's right, it is your online child psychology course, and I'm here to walk you through the hottest topics in nature through nurture. This is just a kind of a basic biological overview of prenatal development, a little bit, early child development, and just kind of some theories and approaches to analyzing biological aspects of child development. I also include at the end of this lecture some mechanisms in which culture is transmitted among people and kind of intergenerationally. All right, with that said, let's jump into it. Beginning with species heredity, a genetic endowment that members of a species have in common. It includes genes that influence biological maturation in the aging process. Species heredity supports the theory that some aspects of development and aging in certain patterns of development and aging are universal. Humans don't fly. So kind of the idea here is that we are all humans. So although there is variation in behavior or whatever, personalities, and everyone's like this magical, whatever, unique kind of individual, if you're kind of a Western perspective, there is still kind of like limits to that on a biological and genetic level. We all kind of go through certain biological processes that are universal, such as like puberty, for example. And there are constraints on human development. So we're not magically going to start flying like some of us. Some of us are not going to magically turn invisible and develop superpowers or whatever. So what this is telling us is that there are specific biological constraints that confine specific potential developmental outcomes across the lifespan. So although there is variability at a cultural level or an individual level, we are still kind of all humans. Very, very wonderful, very beautiful. Moving on to classic Darwin arguments, he argues that there's genetic variations in species. Without this, an environmental challenge could wipe out entire species. Some genes aid adaptation more than others. Some are good, some are bad. Genes that aid their bearers in adapting to their environment will be passed on to future generation more frequently than genes that do not. Natural selection. So this is kind of classic like Darwin stuff. Kind of our big takeaways here is that there's variation genetically and biologically within the species. It's argued because, or any species, not just humans, that you can imagine like a big wide-scale disaster, and if everybody is exactly the same on a biological level, again, we are mostly 99.9 whatever percent the same. However, there's still some variation. But kind of the point is, if some kind of natural disaster happens, some kind of virus or I don't know, some zombie outbreak or something, I don't know, or environmental catastrophe happens, that variation allows for some members of the species to live and thus kind of keep the species alive. Because whatever that big kind of macro or environmental stressor is, it theoretically, because there's variation genetically and biologically, it can't kill everyone. Thus, some people survive and again pass on, keep the species going. Some genes are more adaptive than others, kind of roughly stated. So some genes basically are adaptive within certain contexts, while in other contexts, certain genes or biological outcomes are not as positively adaptive. So depending on the environment that you are living in, some biological outcomes, some genetic adaptations or genetic variability is positive, while you put that same kind of biological adaptation in a different context, and it becomes kind of less positively adaptive. Both the environment and genes affect evolution. Evolutionary psychology is the application of evolutionary theory to understanding human thinking and behavior limitations. Bias towards individual interpretations, brain flexibility / adaptation is thought to be the legacy of human evolution. So kind of we have this field of evolutionary psychology that kind of tries to look at the world around us and kind of understand it in terms of evolutionary theory, which, I mean, exists, obviously. So, that is useful, but it's also kind of very difficult to say kind of what individual developmental outcome that you're looking at is like rooted in some kind of biological process that occurred, whatever, 100,000 years ago, something along those lines. All we kind of have in front of us are what we see. We can't like build a time machine yet. So it's kind of difficult to try and figure out, okay, it's this kind of evolutionary adaptive, so maybe something like attachment is, and we'll talk about that later on, but kind of an idea that you need a caregiver because humans, babies really can't do much. However, there are potential biases that emerge. So you can maybe look around the world around you and see some kind of discrimination. So whatever, classically like women, racial minorities, certain religious groups excluded from certain university settings or certain jobs. And you can look at that and say, oh, evolution, this is probably because of evolution. There's some kind of biological difference that places women outside of academia or something like that. When instead it's kind of just pure kind of social organization kind of thing that you've chosen at this period of time that can be moved. So trying to kind of disentangle kind of just contemporary views of the world with, this is the hard biological truth can be quite difficult. And it can be prone to kind of biased interpretations that are self-serving for whoever it is dominant within that particular social order within that historical era. But one kind of other specific adaptation, kind of maybe rooted in evolution or something along those lines, is kind of brain flexibility and adaptation, which we talked about throughout this course, and we will continue to talk about it. Again, kind of our environments, our social interactions, literally like shape our brain, shape our behaviors, impact our genetics, which we'll talk about momentarily. But the idea here is that through that kind of adaptation, that flexibility, that biological, that neurological, that genetic mechanisms allow for you kind of to theoretically adapt to your environment and thus kind of like survive. So it's kind of like plus and minus. So you're kind of worthless for years of your life, but at the same time, you're kind of like theoretically being, in some ways, being adapted to or being shaped by your environment, which theoretically will allow you to survive in said environments as you progress throughout your lifespan. The genetic code. Sperm cells and an ovum each contribute 23 chromosomes to the zygote, to total 46 in total. Sperm and ovum produced by meiosis. Chromosomes are slender threads inside the cell's nucleus that carry genes. That is the genetic material. DNA is a double helix-shaped molecule that stores everything cells need to replicate. So just kind of basic definitions here. We don't need to go into that much detail. Besides that, the sperm cell and the ovum cell, both having 23 chromosomes coming together, and well, I should say both the two sets of 23 chromosomes coming together to form total, I should say, 46 chromosomes. And in that process of those chromosomes coming together, sometimes a chromosome can be altered, or there can be some kind of damage, which can result in either early child death or a chromosome-related disorder. Again, just basic definitions here. Cell replication. Mitosis. A cell divides to produce two identical cells, each containing the same 46 chromosomes. Zygotes become multiple cell organisms through this process of mitosis. Moving on to the Human Genome Project. This is a project instituted by the U.S. government with some other countries, but really a big U.S. funded project to kind of map out the entirety of the genome. Researchers mapped sequences of chemical units / letters that make up the strands of DNA in a full set of 46 human chromosomes. 3% of the human genome consists of what was defined as genes, parts of the DNA that are transported into RNA, acts as template for protein production. While the other 97% of the human genome play critical roles in regulating activity of the protein-producing genes, originally called junk DNA. What was found was that about 99.9%, depending on the calculation, there's like 99.6, whatever, it's more or less, you get the idea, of the genome is the same across all humans. So this is a massive multi-billion-dollar project that's occurred throughout the 21st century. Kind of the big takeaways here is one, the big 99% number, wherein basically we are all basically almost identical genetically. And kind of the goal was to maybe identify genes that do certain behaviors, or genes associated with certain behaviors, or genes associated with certain disorders, something along those lines. Kind of a mixed bag that was found. And in general, we'll talk about this momentarily. There's any kind of like complex social behavior. There's really not like the one gene kind of thing. And what we found out is like, oh, this is far more complicated than maybe what we thought. And also the environment obviously plays a role in not just genetic expression, but developmental outcomes. Let's talk about the two different types of twins, beginning with identical. This is abbreviated typically as MZ, monozygotic, mono, one. Originate from one zygote, one fertilized ovum divides to form identical individuals. This occurs about 1 out of 250 births. And then fraternal twins, typically referred to as DZ, two ova are released at approximately the same time, and each is fertilized by a different sperm. This occurs about 1 out of 125 births. So for clarity, the fraternal twins, this is when you see, actually I knew some people in like elementary school, middle school, who are twins but are different genders. And this is related to ovums, again, being two being released at the same time and two different sperm cells fertilizing it. So although they're kind of born at the same time, unlike the identical twins that basically more or less share almost identical DNA, fraternal twins who share approximately 50% of their DNA, or I should say their genomes. And this is the same as basically any other sibling, due to them being fertilized by two different sperm cells and them consisting of two different ovas. Sex chromosomes. Chromosomes of the 23rd pair are the sex chromosomes, male X chromosome and Y chromosome, while females consist of two X chromosomes. Father determines the child gender, sperm carries X or Y chromosomes. So again, kind of definitional here. We just have males for sex hormones consisting of an X and a Y chromosome, while females have two X chromosomes. And it's important to note that the sperm determines the sex of the child, and because the sperm carries either an X or a Y chromosome, while the ovum already has a X chromosome. So X plus whatever X or Y. Thus determining the sex of the child. Genotype versus phenotype. Genotype is defined as our kind of genetic makeup, kind of like the nut and bolts, the biology, the genetics of ourselves. And phenotype is our observable traits, which can include behavior or things kind of like hair color, or eye color, or height, something along those lines. But ultimately, it's something you see, while the genotype is something that's going on at a genetic, microscopic level. Gene expression, activation or deactivation of genes by environmental experiences throughout development. And we'll circle back around to this with kind of epigenetics, but kind of the idea here is that genes can be activated or deactivated depending on certain environmental experiences. So it's not just like, boom, you got the gene, therefore you're locked in. It doesn't work like this. There are complex kind of interactions in general, especially for kind of complex behavioral outcomes and even health outcomes as well. This is well documented. So you can almost think of it like a light switch, where in certain environmental contexts can activate genes or kind of deactivate genes, broadly stated. Single genetic inheritance. Thousands of human characteristics are influenced by only one pair of genes, one from the mother or one from the father. Dominant gene, a gene that will be expressed when paired with a recessive gene. A recessive gene is a weaker gene that can be dominated. Many or most psychological traits, in contrast, probably aren't influenced simply by dominant or recessive genes. They're influenced by hundreds or thousands of genes, exerting tiny effects. So this is kind of the classic recessive dominant genes that you basically learn about in kind of like Bio 101. So like brown hair or brown eyes being more dominant than green eyes, for example. Dark hair being more dominant than blonde hair. Thus, kind of like the dominant, if you got both traits, your kind of dominant trait is more likely to be expressed. That is, again, for example, dark hair, brown eyes. However, kind of complex behavior, psychological traits, even many health outcomes, as stated, are far more complicated than this. There's not just like there's no such thing, I'll spoil it now, as the alcoholism gene. Does not exist. Rather, to the extent that genes are impacting any particular developmental outcome, it's typically hundreds or thousands of genes working in very complex ways that, frankly, we don't understand. And all of kind of those genes come together to maybe exert tiny influences in kind of a complex, kind of systematic or dynamic way. So almost kind of like how the brain, and maybe you've encountered in previous psychology classes or other biological classes, where in the brain, multiple parts of the brain are kind of working together in tandem, multiple like systems, regions of the brain, kind of in this interactive, very complex way. You can conceptualize this as genetics as well. I actually had a colleague of mine who looked at kind of some early childhood developmental outcomes, and she was looking at kind of this network approach of genes kind of working together with the environment to influence outcomes. Polygenetic inheritance. This is defined as any trait or any outcome, really, influenced by multiple pairs of genes interacting with multiple environmental factors. Traits and abilities are multifactorial. That is, they depend on many factors which interact with each other in complex ways. So this is basically just giving a term to kind of the concept that was just going over here, wherein we kind of a lot of genes working together with a lot of different environmental factors, going kind of back to that Bronfenbrenner model, interacting in very complex ways to influence developmental outcomes. Pleiotropic effects. This is kind of conceptualized as the fact that any one gene may influence a variety of outcomes. For example, one particular gene was linked to lung cancer in Black U.S. Americans and an increased risk of heart attack in white U.S. Americans. A specific pleiotropic effect occurs when some genes, or a collection of genes, have a general effect on many related abilities. Similar genes impact a range of verbal and nonverbal cognitive abilities, even though, or I should say, each thought to slightly influence these developmental outcomes. So as stated before, we have these polygenetic effects, kind of a little vague, abstract a little bit, but kind of like this collection of genes working together in very high complex ways alongside the environment to influence developmental outcomes. But it gets even more complicated because research has demonstrated that a particular gene can influence a variety of outcomes depending on the group you belong to. So for example, in this study here in U.S. Americans, black and white U.S. Americans, they found that one particular gene was linked to lung cancer and another was linked to heart attack. So again, kind of both negative developmental outcomes, but we see this gene, the same gene influencing the specific negative development, or I should say, increasing the likelihood of a specific negative developmental outcome occurring differently between these two races. So we basically have two different negative developmental outcomes. So the gene may be broadly related to this negative developmental outcomes, but the specific negative developmental outcome, either A, heart attack, or B, lung cancer, varies across groups. This can also be kind of interpreted more kind of this generalist kind of approach. So kind of the idea here is that pleiotropic effects kind of impacting a kind of broad range or a kind of a general effect of interrelated abilities. So kind of like before we had these two negative developmental outcomes related to cancer or heart attack. Here you can also have kind of collections of genes impacting kind of like a range of abilities. So for example, verbal and nonverbal cognitive abilities. So specific genes not related to like, oh, this gene is for your working memory and this gene is for your long-term memory, but rather maybe sets of genes kind of impacting broadly stated memory, or in this case here, broadly stated a range of verbal and nonverbal cognitive abilities. So something like specific sets of genes impacting specific domains of development in small ways and in kind of complex ways. Or I should say each kind of specific one gene or whatever, having kind of small effects, but maybe cumulatively having a larger effect, and then this going on in a very complex way. Mutations. This is defined as a change in the structure or arrangement of one or more genes. It can be beneficial depending on the environment and the type of mutation. Odds that mutation will occur are increased by radiation and toxic waste. Most are just spontaneous errors during cell division. Odds of mutations increase as parents get older, typically a different version of a particular gene. So some mutations can be positive. There's some kind of like theories, I believe, that like humans' development of language is kind of rooted in just random mutation. But again, it's just kind of one theory. So theoretically, just say, oh, there's some truth to that or whatever. Oh, that's a good mutation to the extent that we love verbalizing with each other. But other mutations can be negative, kind of resulting from like toxic waste and radiation. You see this in kind of like nuclear fallout zones, or where there's a lot of like industrial runoff where animals will interact with it and then kind of have abnormalities that grow, and you can kind of see them physically, not just like tumors, but kind of literally like changes in their genetics. But typically, kind of mutations occur just by a spontaneous error through replication processes. And the odds of that spontaneous error occurring increases as the parent gets older. So kind of that's one reason why, having a child at like 48 or something is a little more risky than having a child at like 24 because of these spontaneous errors that can occur during cell division as the zygote is developing. Chromosome disorders emerge when a child receives too many, too few, or an abnormal chromosomes at conception. Some examples include Down syndrome, Turner syndrome, and XYY syndromes. For example, in Down syndrome, in the 21st position, 3 chromosomes are present instead of 2. In Turner syndrome, only one chromosome in the 23rd position. Any deviation from the 46 chromosomes that are normally contained in 23 pairs will result in a chromosome disorder. Each single chromosome contains a large number of genes, so any deviation results in a number of characteristics affected. The main cause of pregnancy loss. So our big takeaways really here is that because chromosomes contain so many genes, if there's kind of errors in chromosome, there's either too many, too few, or there's some kind of breakage that occurs within chromosomes, this can result in various chromosome-related disorders developing. And as stated, this is one of the main causes of, or the main cause of pregnancy loss. There are ways to kind of test the likelihood of certain disorders developing. This is done through genetic counseling, which provides information about the nature, the likelihood, the effects, and treatment of genetically based disorders. Carriers do not have the disease but can transmit the gene for it to their children. For example, sickle cell trait versus disease. This is found in humans close to infestations of mosquitoes, such as West Africa, the Mediterranean, the Middle East, East Asia. It protects against provides partial protection against a type of malaria. Environmental insults, such as low oxygen environments, contribute to red blood cells deforming into a sickled shape and become adhesive, sabotaging the cell's ability to carry sufficient oxygen and causing them to block small blood vessels, including capillaries. These events trigger excruciating, painful episodes. So we'll walk through some different forms of genetic counseling momentarily, but I want to, here in this slide, focus on this carrier, this trait kind of versus disease momentarily. So sickle cell trait is kind of a classic example here of kind of an adaptation, really. This is providing a partial protection against certain types of malaria found traditionally, as stated, close to infestations of mosquitoes. So West Africa, Mediterranean, like Italy, kind of stuff like that. Middle East, East Asia, so kind of the idea here is that you can see theoretically kind of an evolutionary process occurring, wherein human populations close to this insect or dying from malaria, and then kind of develop certain biological adaptations to try and prevent that death from occurring. However, in certain environments, that adaptation can be more negative. So it's kind of a severe low oxygen environment, for example. This can cause the sickle cell trait to kind of turn into a disease wherein oxygen basically is not able to be transported kind of across the organism, or the human in this case, which can be quite painful and on occasion, depending on just like a stroke or something like that, be fatal. But kind of the more mild conditions, more or less, you'll be fine. Kind of the big point here is that adaptations occur, which may be positive in some environments. In other environments, low oxygen environments, they can be quite painful, or kind of theoretically through strokes and other mechanisms be fatal. And these are just kind of some mechanisms in which to identify disorders prenatally. They include ultrasounds, which consist of sending sound waves to scan the womb, maternal blood sampling, analyze DNA of offspring from placenta, and kind of through that blood sample, researchers or medical professionals are able to identify the presence of certain diseases or the potential for any disorders. Pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, vitro fertilization in the lab, test cells which form from mitosis. And kind of the broad outlines here is that pre-implantation genetic diagnosis kind of uses IVF, that is in vitro fertilization, to take kind of a fertilized, or I should say, acquire egg cells and sperm cells, and then basically you could grow them in the lab. And we'll kind of, for, I don't know, a few days or something along those lines, let that embryo kind of develop within a lab, and then extract some cells from there, that lab-grown fertilized eggs, to test it for, test kind of those cells for any potential diseases or potential chromosome-related disorders. And this is kind of typically done for couples who have a family history, or for some reason worried about any some kind of a chromosomal disorder or some kind of other disease that may emerge during pregnancy. So this is kind of a way in which that you can kind of test the likelihood of that occurring, and then theoretically, if there are no diseases present or no disorders likely to be present, then kind of re-implant that embryo back into a woman's uterus. Kind of like a lot of these approaches, these genetic approaches really kind of brings up like ethical questions. To what kind of extent should humans kind of be meddling with this, kind of maybe even genetic kind of like manipulation? What kind of information should you share with your child if they end up developing a disorder? So kind of how much of that information should you share with your child? Should you be doing this at all? These are all kind of like hotly debated topics. Behavioral genetics. This is a scientific study of the extent to which genetic or environmental differences among people are responsible for differences. Heritability, percentage of the variability in a trait across individuals that is due to genes. Some traits are thought to be highly heritable, such as height, while others are thought not to be as heritable, such as religious affiliation. Height among plants may be largely heritable. However, watering these plants and environmental manipulation can result in substantial increases in their heights. High heritability doesn't imply unchangeability. So what these researchers are trying to do is kind of identify like what percentage of, I'll just make up something, extroversion is genetic related and what percentage is environmentally related. So they basically use they try to develop like, it's really just a ratio of how much of a trait or developmental outcome is genetically based and how much is like environmentally based. And this is kind of a rough dichotomy, obviously, because genes and the environment interact in very complex ways. But just taking it at kind of face value and kind of unpacking this a little bit, again, we kind of have this ratio of environment and genes, and then thus how high something is heritable. That is, how much of something is related to kind of just genes or something along those lines. And we have kind of different ideas here. So something like religious affiliation, there's not going to be like the Catholic gene or something along those lines. But I must stress that high heritability does not imply unchangeability. Even things that are like listed as high heritability are still highly influenced by the environment. So, for example, height. I've done personally research that has looked at the impact of prenatal stress on infant height, nutrition on infant height, all these kind of postnatal, early childhood environmental factors impacting this quote-unquote kind of high heritability, a high heritable outcome, that is height. So although something can be high heritable, they can still be manipulated by the environment. It also suggests that something that's rated or like described as being highly heritable can also be maybe shifted to maybe less heritable depending on environmental manipulation. So for example, imagine just some crops, some plants, whatever, just in some soil, and we just leave it alone, right, and let it grow. Okay, well, we didn't touch it at all, and all of a sudden we're like, okay, well, this is pretty highly heritable. We see here that some plants made it, some don't. Obviously, there's still some environmental factors going on here with sun and the quality of the soil, whatever, but still, it's highly heritable. But let's, for example, say, okay, well, I'm going to water some, or I'm going to identify the crops that are a little like beat up or whatever and give it more nutrition, whatever, some kind of plant food or something along those lines. Now, all of a sudden, that ratio is a little different. Now, that highly heritable trait of that plant growing, that plant height, is now much more influenced by my environmental manipulation. So again, this is a very complex kind of there's huge debates kind of in the field about behavioral genetics. But kind of the idea here again is that this is attempting to identify what developmental outcomes are genetically based, which are environmentally based, and maybe some kind of combination of those two in some kind of ratio form. Now, one way behavioral genetics tries to test the degree to which any developmental outcome is heritable is through twin studies. Determine whether twin studies reared together are more similar to each other than fraternal twins reared together. So kind of the idea here is that we look at two sets of twins, the identical twins with theoretically almost the same DNA, and fraternal twins who are twins but share only 50% of their DNA. And then what researchers will do will compare the developmental outcomes in those two sets of twins. So whatever, how extroverted they are. So we say, oh, both identical twins have the same levels of extroversion, while the fraternal twins, there's some similarities, but nowhere near the same as identical twins. Therefore, that is telling us that extroversion is related to genetics. Because, again, the identical twins, the MZ twins, the monozygotic twins, are very similar, while the DZ twins, the fraternal twins, are far less similar. Again, that suggests that because identical twins share more or less the same exact DNA, that is telling us, oh, that extroversion is very much is very heritable. It's very genetically based. Now, some limitations to this approach include identical twins could be more psychologically similar because they shared a prenatal environment. Some scholars argue the prenatal environment is the most important predictor of future developmental outcomes. So, for example, we're going to compare twin siblings, identical twins to, I don't know, other siblings or something along those lines. You're kind of not considering or taking into account the prenatal environment. And some scholars argue that the prenatal development environment is like super, super important and possibly the most predictive of future developmental outcomes. So basically what twin studies are doing is really not considering this prenatal environment and thus potentially biasing the results and maybe giving an inaccurate or drawing an inaccurate conclusion about the extent to which something is genetically based, because they are not factoring in the impacts of the prenatal environment, which is obviously difficult to measure, but still very, very impactful, as we'll talk about throughout this class, and especially next chapter. They do not account for the environmental impact, intergenerational life history, or genetic expression, or the genome. And this is kind of, there's a lot of aspects of this, but one other thing that is done with kind of twin studies is, say twins are kind of separated at birth. For whatever reason, they're adopted into different homes, and what they'll do is some researchers will get the twins back together, say when they're like 25 years old, and they had never really interacted with each other, and we say, okay, let's measure their levels of extroversion. Oh, they're really the same, therefore this is very, extroversion is very genetically based. Well, this doesn't really account for example, intergenerational life histories. We do know that there's kind of intergenerational impacts of like on a genetic level, which may be passed on kind of to both genes, or to both sets of twins. So kind of that intergenerational genetic history passed on to both twins. But the important part here is that that intergenerational life history of genes is really kind of rooted theoretically in kind of environmental influences of that sets of twins' parents or their grandparents or great-grandparents, whatever along those lines. So kind of unpacking like, okay, are these really, was really what driving this is just like this genetic, almost like determinism, or really is it kind of this intergenerational history of development that's now impacting future cohorts of children within that same family on a biological level. So thus we're kind of attributing genes as kind of like this random thing, but really it actually reflects this kind of complex intergenerational history. And again, these are very, very complex questions and difficult to kind of unpack. And really, we're just kind of beginning to kind of think about this and think it through and test it. Identical twins are often treated similarly. So kind of the idea here is that although twins are, again, sharing a very similar DNA, that is identical twins, they may also be kind of treated very similarly. So it's not just theoretically like this genetic similarity contributing to extroversion developmental outcomes, but also parenting. And if the parents are kind of treating both sets of twins very similarly, this is kind of an environmental factor which may be contributing to the development of extroversion similarly in both twins because they are being parented in very similar ways. Heritability technically says little or nothing about how malleable a trait is, and heritability is not a fixed number. If a range of environmental influences on a trait within a population are reduced, the heritability of that trait will increase because more of the differences in that trait will be due to genetic factors. So kind of again what I was talking about with the plant example. Because this is really just kind of like a ratio of gene to environment, if you take away environmental impacts of something, like there's no environmental manipulation or something, now that ratio is basically almost like 100 genes because there's, or 100% genetically based. Broadly speaking, it's a very crude way of putting it. So when you reduce one side of that ledger, one side of that ratio, you're going to automatically basically increase the amount of heritability associated with a particular trait. And that is because there's no environmental manipulation, and thus the only differences that are left are due to quote-unquote genetic differences. So again, twin studies are very interesting, but still very much a lot to unpack related to them. Adoption studies. Are children adopted early in life psychologically similar to their biological parents or their adoptive parents? Some limitations include genes in the prenatal environment the biological mother provided can influence development. Adoption agencies try to place children in homes similar to those that they were adopted from, and children are typically adopted to above average environments which could underestimate the full effects of the environment. So I talked about this a little briefly about these adoptive studies, wherein maybe identical twins or fraternal twins who are siblings, whatever, get separated early on in childhood and grow up differently, aren't really in contact with each other, and then they are somehow come back together, and then researchers can test, oh, is extroversion, do they have same levels of extroversion? Do they have same levels, do both siblings have the same levels of shyness, of fear, aggression, whatever? And if they are like exactly the same, you could theoretically draw the conclusion, oh, this is very genetically based. Anger is very genetically based. Shyness is genetically based. Extroversion, whatever. Some limitations include, as I stated before, kind of the prenatal environment influencing the developmental outcomes. So if both kind of siblings are exposed to that prenatal development, they are still growing up in a very similar environment. Even if they're separated at birth, you still have months of that similar environment, or that similar developmental environment. Also, adoption agencies try to place children in homes similar to those that were adopted from. So maybe the siblings are placed in similar homes as their biological parents and similar homes as each other, thus are receiving kind of similar sets of environmental influences, thus kind of making that number of, of that extroversion score more similar than they were if you put one child in like rural Bolivia and another child in like, I don't know, Tokyo or something along those lines. So because adoption agencies place children in kind of very similar homes to which they were adopted from and kind of similar homes to each other, maybe we're kind of underestimating the influence of that environmental similarity on these developmental outcomes. Family studies includes pairs of siblings who have a variety of different degrees of genetic similarity and can follow them longitudinally. Measures qualities of family members' experiences to determine similarities and difference in siblings' environments. So kind of the idea here is that longitudinal study, that is, you're kind of following these siblings or these families very early in their lives or whatever, some point in their lives. But the point is you're following them for years and you're taking data from them. So whatever, say every like 1 year, researchers come to the family household and do some interviews and various amounts of tests, and they measure all kinds of health outcomes, social outcomes, cognitive outcomes, and kind of compared those results among the siblings and the parents to say, okay, these are very, very similar. What percentage of this is due to shared environment? What percentage of this is due to some kind of genetics or something along those lines? Because you can also measure basically how often does a person work? How do these children go to the same school? How old are they? What are their peers? All these kind of different social and kind of genetic variables to hopefully try and find factors that contribute to certain developmental outcomes. Moving on to gene-environment interactions, the effects of genes depend on what kind of environment we experience. How we respond to the environment is also influenced by the genes we have. It is often a combination of high-risk genes and high-risk environments that come together to trigger psychological problems. Let's jump into some more specifics before we break this down. Well, actually first, let's break down this concept really quick and then we'll jump into specifics. Genotype-environment correlations. Process by which the genetic factors contribute to variations in the environment. People with different genes have different experiences. So this is really what this is about here, is that we have different experiences that will happen to us that is correlated with kind of our genes. And this can occur through a couple of different ways, which we're about to break down. So beginning with passive genotype environment correlations. This occurs when children passively inherit the genes in the environment that their family takes pride in. This is because parents provide children with both their genes in a home environment compatible with said genes. The home environments to which children are exposed to are correlated with and are typically likely to reinforce their genotypes. So, kind of breaking this down a little bit, we all inherit genes from our parents. And theoretically, this can also be influenced by intergenerational effects of genes or what, all these other things. But let's just keep it simple right now. So we all inherit kind of sets of genes from our parents. Okay, but it's not only that. We also inherit the home that we live in, so the home environment, which theoretically are going to be associated with the genes of our parents, because theoretically our genes are reflecting our behaviors. So, for example, say, again, this is broadly stated and not really true at all, but say I inherit some kind of a collection of music-related genes or something along those lines. Again, very crude speaking, not really accurate, but for the purpose of this example. So whatever, I inherit some kind of like sets of musical genes or something like that, or make me more inclined to be musically inclined, like be proficient in music. Well, at the same time that I've inherited that collection of genes, I'm going to go home to my parents' house, which theoretically, and let's just say they have some upper middle class money, they have a piano in the house, they have instruments in the house, or whatever, they have Alexa constantly playing classical music. They're playing music all the time. They're constantly bringing us to theaters or whatever, operas or something along those lines, even as a baby. So not only have we received those genes, but we're also being exposed to our home environment that's going to reflect those genes of our parents, okay, in this case here, these musical genes. So basically we're passively receiving the genes, and we're passively existing in an environment that theoretically are reinforcing our genetic predispositions. So we're inheriting predispositions, and then basically the home environment or kind of the activities that our parents take us on kind of like cause those genes to be expressed. So a combination of predisposition, genetic predisposition, and a combination of environmental impacts, both passively received from by us. In this case, we're 1 day old or whatever, 2 weeks old, from our parents or caregivers. In contrast, the active genotype environment correlations occurs when individuals seek out environments that support their genetic tendencies. The individual with a genetic predisposition to be extroverted is likely to go to every party in sight, invite friends over, join organizations, collect Facebook friends, and otherwise build a, quote, niche that is highly socially stimulating and that strengthens social skills. So this time here, we inherit certain genetic predispositions. In this case, we have extroversion. And in the cases of active genotype environment correlations, we are actively seeking out environments that allow us to kind of genetically express those extroverted predispositions. That is, the environment supports our genetic predispositions. So say again, I inherit from my family some kind of genetic predisposition for extroversion. Well, now in an active scenario, I am now seeking out environments which reinforce that contribute to the expression of that extroversion predisposition that I inherited. So in this case here, it's active because I, as a person who has received those genes, are now seeking environments that reinforce those genetic tendencies, because I'm at extroverted environments and I'm practicing my social skills and participating in socially stimulating environments, which again kind of activate those predispositions. So that's the difference. So on the one hand, passive, we're just kind of receiving it. We're little babes, and we're just receiving the Alexa playing classical music. Well, active, we are whatever, a 17-year-old sneaking out of the house, and we're going out to some kind of rave or whatever. But importantly, both sets of correlation reinforce and contribute to the expression of our genetic predispositions. Next, we have evocative genotype environment and correlations. And this is defined as how the social environment reacts to individuals based on their inherited characteristics. Whether one has a more outgoing or shy temperament will affect how he or she is treated by others. So in this case here, it's our social environment reacting to us. So for example, say I'm very outgoing and thus I'm kind of going out to the club or whatever. Other people are going to recognize me being outgoing and whatever. I'm dancing around, I'm drinking, I'm screaming, I'm doing whatever. I'm going ham, I'm hitting the gritty. And people are going to recognize that, and then they're going to react to me in ways that hopefully are positive. And they're like, whoa, that person's that extroverted. I'm going to treat them like they're extroverted and interact with them in ways that kind of reinforce their genetic predisposition of extroversion. So in this case here, the environment kind of reacting to the way that we are acting within a given environment, and this reinforces those genetic tendencies. And then finally, genotype environment interactions. This involves the genetic susceptibility to the environment. The concept of gene-environment interaction tells us that people with different genes react differently to the experiences they have. By contrast, the concept of gene-environment correlation says that people with different genes have different experiences. So kind of the point here is, again, the correlations, the genotype environment correlations are really situated in the experiences that we have. That can be passive, again, receiving from our parents in our household. That can be active, me going to the club. And I can also receive it evocatively, which means the environment reacting to me in that environment, reacting to my extroversion. Versus these genotype environment interactions, kind of the idea here is that a person with different genetic predispositions will react differently to the experiences they have. So maybe they can experience the same or whatever. They imagine two people with different kind of genetic predispositions in the exact same environment, in the same rave club. And one of them is reacting very positively, and maybe the other one is reacting very negatively. Maybe they hate rave or whatever. They don't want to be there. Or maybe someone has some kind of genetic predisposition to like aggression or something. And we're like at a rave and everybody's like bumping up against us. And the one person is like, woo, this is awesome. This is a great time. Pass me that Molly. Well, the other time, this may be person with a predisposition to anger, or maybe just don't like that confined space and it's too hot or whatever. I don't know. And they're like, ugh, I don't like this. I got to get the hell out of here. I'm irritated. I'm going to punch somebody. Or I just want to just go home. Whatever. Something along those lines. But kind of the point here is that people can experience the exact same experience, or can be in the exact same environment, or have be within the same kind of experience, but react differently. Theoretically, this reaction being different is partially rooted in kind of differences in genetic predispositions. And our kind of last genetic topic will be epigenetics. And epigeneticist is defined as the process through which nature and nurture co-act to bring forth particular developmental outcomes. Epigenetic effects, environmental factors affect whether or not particular genes and particular cells are expressed. Might explain differences in identical twins. So for example, the key point here is that when you inherit genes, they are typically predispositions. It does not mean that you're going to for sure have that gene impact you in any meaningful way. So we can both, for example, imagine two sets of people and we both inherit a predisposition for aggression or something along those lines. Well, one of those people can turn out to be a violent criminal, while the other person never commits any violent crimes and are extremely peaceful. Maybe they're pacifists or something, I don't know. But kind of the idea here is that at-risk genes interact with at-risk environments. So even though two people both have a genetic predisposition for aggression, the person who grew up in a very at-risk environment, like a poor area, or just extremely stressful, traumatic upbringing for whatever environmental, whatever various amounts of environmental reasons, those people that have that anger genetic predisposition and experience that super high-risk environment are more likely for that gene to be activated. So that predisposition goes from just, you're susceptible to future anger outbursts, but only in the presence of a very traumatic experience. So you can think of a genetic predisposition, again, like a light switch, turning on and off. And what's turning that light switch on and off? The environment. I've worked in a lab in the Democratic Republic of Congo, kind of looking at the impact of being exposed to war and whatever, various poverty-related stressors, and seeing if that is correlated with the activation of particular genes, and spoiler alert, they are. So again, this is just an example of how the environment even impacts genetic expression. So you can imagine a set of twins with almost identical DNA, one of them being exposed to maybe a highly traumatic experience. Maybe they go to a different school or whatever, they have different friends, and and they get exposed to something highly traumatic. And then all of a sudden, that one twin's genetic predisposition for whatever, depression, for example, is activated due to that highly traumatic experience, while the other twin's genetic predisposition for depression is not activated because they have different peer groups and never experienced that traumatic event. But you can see here the complexity of genes and how the environment impacts these genetic processes. Broadly stated, the environment has been shown to provide lifelong effects. And specifically, early family experiences have been demonstrated to have lifelong effects on developmental outcomes. Depending on the outcome and the experience, there are variations in this, but broadly stated. Parents who provide basic trust to their children instill a sense of self-worth, good coping skills, the ability to form meaningful relationships, and a solid foundation for the core values children will take through adulthood. The National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey has found that adults, which tests and kind of measures a whole variety of developmental outcomes. In this case here, we're looking at adults' depression symptoms. This is just one question, a lot of questions that are asked to adults and children. And what this survey found was that at every age, those who live in impoverished environments reported more symptoms of depression. So as stated throughout this class, the environment matters. And growing up in environments that are traumatic, harsh, is associated with kind of negative developmental outcomes across the lifespan, while experiencing positive environments is associated with obviously a whole host of positive developmental outcomes. But not only that, but even in kind of like, you can imagine a family who's like cohesive, a positive family living in a tough, difficult neighborhood, thus kind of experiencing a lot of stressors. That family's kind of unity, or extended family, or whatever, a community, or some kind of community organization or something along that line, can again act as a protective factor, wherein they can act together to provide each other social support to kind of decrease the negative impacts of kind of a traumatic environment or traumatic events happening to them. So it's not just like, oh, something bad happened to me, you're for sure going to have bad things happen. You're going to for sure like locked into negative developmental outcomes. But again, it's about increasing odds and also these protective factors, which range from really family related, maybe individually related, all the way up to like macro related. With that said, I think we can wrap it up here for this chapter. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have a great week. Bye-bye, everyone.